Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I think what would help Jennifer and I out a little bit is we could go around the room and just get introductions from all of you, kind of what drew you to this besides just getting to see us, which I know is compelling enough, but really what made you want to come to this particular lecture. So if we could go around the room, that would help. Thanks.
I'm Steve Schlickman. I'm the Executive Director of the Urban Transportation Center, but what particularly interests me in this is the fact that my mother spent 25 years on the Arlington Heights Housing Commission and became an advocate as a conservative Republican for the homeless in Arlington Heights, which people deny.
Yes, we know that.
So I'm Megan McInerney. I'm a research specialist here at GCI and am interested in suburban poverty and planning.
I'm Jacob Jones, student at CUPA, and I grew up in Suburbs.
I'm Natalie Robinson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Liverpool. I'm currently in Chicago doing some field work around homelessness in the city, the kind of idea of the right to the city using visual methods. So I'm really interested in the book. Thank you.
My name is Brian Tompkins. I'm an urban planning major. I was interested in learning about nonprofits and public sector and how they work together.
I'm Jackson Morsi. I'm a master's of urban planning, and I focus on community development. So I've always been interested in the housing kind of thing.
Teresa Cordova, Director for Disease Institute, and interested in suburban planning and population.
Edward
Yeah, hi. I'm Edward Berry. I'm with the Urban Transportation Center, and I handle public affairs.
I'm Jennifer Miller. I'm a program manager with Cook County. Interested in this twofold. One, I serve my career in homeless services, so just to have a passion for that work, but also I'm coordinating our 5-year strategic plan around affordable housing, community development, and economic development, which will certainly tackle this issue. So I'm very happy to be here.
I'm Lauren Carroll, and I'm Suburban Cook County. But I work closely, work with our ESP program, and so I actually work a lot with Jennifer, and so that's a large part of the reason I'm here. And also, I'm a mom, so I finished in 2004. Welcome back.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that you all came. We're going to kind of treat this somewhat informally. We want this to be, in many cases, a discussion. We're going to have some information about homelessness in the suburbs and some of the things that we're doing about it. But I would just encourage you to feel free if you have questions. Just throw something at me, somehow get my attention so that we can respond to it. So we're just going to start again with a kind of a conversation. I want to hear from you all what you think of when you hear the word homeless. What is it that pops into your mind?
Someone who doesn't have a home.
Someone without a home. Yes, that is if you are to define it, if you are to look in a dictionary, that is exactly it. Someone without a home. Anybody else? Yeah.
It could be you have a home, you consider your home, but it's not legal to have.
That's true. That's true. There are those people who might consider their home as a garage.
Well, I remember a guy hid himself in a basketball bridge and turned it into his home.
Yeah. And there are many people who will do that with a place to take a place that, as we refer to it, not meant for human habitation, and they will make that their home. Others will live in a shelter and treat that as their home, a place that is not really a home, but just what they treat it as. Okay, so we have kind of similar, somebody without a home and then something that is not really a home. What else? Yeah.
What always touches me is I see people living under the expressway here where I live, and there are perfectly good homes that have been abandoned right nearby, and I wonder why can't they move these people to schools?
Oh, the foreclosure crisis has brought up a lot of different potential solutions just like that. And where do you live? Just
In Avondale, which is just north of Golden Square.
Okay. Now, up in the suburbs, if you're looking for anybody under the expressway, you're not going to find it. Up in Lake County, we have the tri-state that runs through, and there's no option for that. And even if there was, we're not near anything when you're on the expressway. There's nothing there. So it's a little bit different when you start thinking about those people that are living not in a place that's unsafe or that's just not in a home. It's that unsheltered population, as we refer to it as, and we'll touch on this a little bit more, is different in the suburbs as it would be in the city. So let's a couple more. Just what is homelessness, and let's start thinking about the people that are actually experiencing it. Who are these people?
Social isolation.
Social isolation. Yeah. Many times they will be not engaged with others. They don't have a support network. If we're just talking, we'll get back to the suburbs again, but just in the city, just walk up and down Jackson. You see on every corner there's somebody, but they're completely isolated from everything else.
I think that's mental illness.
Mental illness, certainly. A lot of people who are experiencing homelessness are experiencing some form of mental illness. There can be just a very mild case, but then there are people who are very severe and persistent, and that can sometimes lead them to a life of the street. All right, one more. We'll give one more chance. Who are the people that are experiencing homelessness?
Someone who's not employable.
Absolutely. We kind of look at some of the root causes. We got mental illness, and then we've got employability. One of the things we always talk about with housing is, if they could have a job or have some sort of income, they would be able to stay in that housing. But if you don't have the employable skills, then that's not going to work. So, we've kind of touched on it, and we stole this right off the flyer here, that homelessness is the quintessential urban problem. And I would agree in many cases, but it's also a problem in the suburban communities as well. And so I always say up in because, I'm in Lake County and we are that last line of defense against Wisconsin. We do what we can to make sure that, we call it the cheddar curtain up there. But in the suburbs, there's some slightly different populations. We don't have Ajax and Boulevard. We don't have those bridges where people can necessarily reside. There may be a quote-unquote hot spot here and there that people may be residing, but it's a little different. It is a hidden population. These are people who are not going to be out there trying to ask for change, otherwise, that social isolation that you were talking about. These are people who are going to be hiding and not really letting you or anybody know that they are, in fact, experiencing homelessness. And so what we try and do with some of our solutions is we try and make sure that they have that ability to get out of that homeless situation. We'll be touching a little bit more on the solutions in just a little bit. But it is a issue that there's commonality between urban and suburban areas and even rural areas. There's a lot of overlap in homelessness, both the problem and the solution. But the suburban part of it is what we're going to be touching on today, obviously. But it's a very hidden population, and that's why many people don't think it's a problem. First thing you brought up about Arlington Heights not having a homeless problem is what many people in suburban communities think. There's no homeless here. They don't exist in my community. They're not around here. I don't see them, so they can't be here. I see them in Chicago. I watch WGN and I see them go down onto Lower Wacker Drive. So that's where they all must be, because they're certainly not in my community because I don't see them. So we'll be touching on different aspects of that, but for now I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer, who's going to give a little bit more in terms of statistics and information about it.
Okay. Well, so we are from different counties, and so I'm going to exercise my prerogative of being the one touching the buttons to start with some Suburban Cook County data, and we've got one Lake County chart as well. But a lot of what's on the slide here is repeated on the little piece of paper that I was handing out. So just to foreshadow, the point in time count is something that happens every other January. So January 2013 was the last full count, both sheltered and unsheltered for most places. We'll do a sheltered count in January of 2014, but January 2013 is the most definitive data. In Chicago, they counted about 6,000 people. In Suburban Cook County, which is everything outside of the city, but still within Cook County, we counted 1,200 people. Now, most of those, all but 151, were in shelter. 151 were unsheltered, and as we were talking about, unsheltered looks a little bit different in the suburbs. That might be someone who is staying in their car. They may hide themselves in forest preserves, and and we can't even really get into the forest preserves, so we hope to count them when they come out of the woods for dinner at a Catholic Charities site, for example. They may be in abandoned buildings. I don't know if that's a big problem in Lake County, but it is characteristic of the south suburbs that there are enough abandoned buildings that there is some squatting going on. There are some other kind of typical unsheltered locations. Maybe staying in a police station lobby, or some of the metro stations have a part of a common area that might be open overnight, although most of them have started locking up to prevent those occasional unsheltered homeless people from staying there, which is kind of a PR issue that we ought to be talking to them about. So those are some kind of typical examples of unsheltered locations. We pay a lot of attention to chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness is that smaller group of people who've been homeless for a year or longer, or maybe they've been homeless 4 times in 3 years. It's a HUD-defined thing, but basically it's the long-term homeless. One of the themes that we'll be talking about is that most people move in and out of homelessness very quickly. That's true in the city as well as the suburbs. That it's what we think of as the long-term homeless person. Most of those images that we have of homeless people, we're thinking about those long-term homeless people. And really that's where we need to focus our energies, because that's where we'll have the most impact on the visibility of the problem, is to really focus on those people who've been homeless for longer periods of time. So we counted 109 chronically homeless people in our last homeless count. About 10% were veterans, 44% were in families with children. It used to be the case that this was a big difference between the city and suburbs, that the city, the majority of their homeless people were individuals, maybe couples, but single adults essentially, and very few families. Then in the suburbs, it was more half and half. I tried to pull those numbers and make my point, but in fact, it's gotten to the place where both in the city and suburbs, it's about 60-40. So most of the people are, did I say that right? So about 40% of the people who we count at a point in time are persons and families. So that discrepancy isn't as different as it used to be. Okay. These next things you'll see in the graphs, but okay, so I did a slide on Suburban Cook County, Lake County, and Chicago. This is historical data from 2007 through 2013. These are all January homeless counts. And if we start with Suburban Cook County, because you just saw that in a little bit more detail, you'll see that the overall number, the top line, has, fortunately for us, been going down. You see a little bit over 1,400, and now we're a little over 1,200. Keep in mind the time period that we're talking about here, 2007 to 2013. There was a recession. We're going to talk about the increase in suburban poverty. For these numbers to be holding steady is really notable. For them to be going down, I would like to think is because we're doing a really great job. Persons and families, you'll see that that yellow line in the middle has, generally speaking, been trending downward for us. On the national level, family homelessness has been slightly increasing. Family homelessness has always been kind of, maybe a third of the population, homeless population across the country, and at the national level, it's been trending upward. For us, we always had relatively more family homeless, and it's trending downward in Suburban Cook County. Chronic homelessness is the kind of gray line at the bottom. It doesn't look as dramatic because it's squashed down here, but if you look, we kind of have peaked out around 250, and we're down to 109. That's a really big deal. That's in a 1-year time even. Well, in a 2-year time rather, from 2011 to 2013. That's a 50% reduction said it on the first slide, a 52% decrease in chronic homelessness between the 2011 full count and the 2013 full count. So, and there's a reason for that. I mean, for us, we've really been focusing on chronic homelessness. All the new permanent supportive housing that's been created has been focused on this subpopulation. And more recently than that, we've created a team that's really working specifically on those long-term homeless who have greater barriers, maybe health conditions, could be mental health related, not necessarily. Substance abuse may be an issue. Criminal justice involvement may also be an issue. This is a tough group of people, but we found that if we focus on that, we have a higher impact. That's been our experience. All right, homelessness in Lake County. Keep in mind that these jagged corners could mean that dozens of people entered or exited homelessness, just because the numbers are relatively small there. But you'll see kind of about 500 people total, homeless people. Out of that, persons and families is kind of around the 200 mark. It's trending downward. I don't know if that's a larger trend or if it's just a dozen people weren't homeless that year. And then chronic homelessness has been fairly steady, basically 30 to 60 people, just almost straight across the line there. Does this say anything to you? Do you have any insight on larger trends?
Well, yeah, and I think the dip has been one that we've talked about because people see that, well, great job in 2009. Well, as Jennifer had mentioned, it's a snapshot. It is one night where we try and find everybody who is experiencing homelessness on that night. And the night that we picked in 2009 was, believe it or not, in January, 50 degrees. And so that is a time where fewer people are seeking shelter. They're more willing to take a chance, so to speak, and be outside. And when they're outside, much more difficult to find. When they go to those abandoned buildings, when they go to those different places, it's almost impossible for us to find them. And so we always kind of treated that as an anomaly just because of the weather and everything. But for our chronic homeless, we've had some difficulty in Lake County in getting some new units that are specifically for that chronically homeless population. These chronically homeless individuals are not the kind of people that you would expect to go through a system and be able to graduate and get a place of their own, pay for it out of their income that they're getting. Their issues are much more complex, and we've had difficulty in creating new units for them. And that has been a problem that we've faced. We didn't, if you go back before 2007, we were up closer to 100. And we did a great job of getting some units in to be able to decrease it, but we have not done very well in the past few years in trying to get some more of those permanent units that are designed for the chronically homeless.
Can I ask a quick question about your data? Are these classifications mutually exclusive, or is there overlap in terms of chronically homeless can also be a homeless person, could also be a person and family, or are these all, does that make sense?
So the total is the total. It does tend to be the case that chronically homeless people does not include families, but I didn't choose measures that were mutually exclusive. Okay. It's not these are the individuals and these are the families. It's more like these are the families, and of the individuals, a certain number of them are at the long term. Okay. And this is all available at, it's a HUD website, onecpd.info. They've got this many years of data. One of the things that Joel and I talked about as we were preparing is that annual data can be more useful for some insights. The point in time data is easier to get for everybody, and probably Joel and I could come up with annual data for our respective geographies, but I don't know that we could come up with it for Chicago. Chronic homelessness in particular, you wonder, is this the same 60 people or the same 200 people? When we've looked at our annual numbers of chronically homeless people, it's not the same 200 people or 100 people. It does tend to be a different group, even though you think of it as long-term. It's not that long-term. Right. All right. Then homelessness in Chicago, just so you can kind of see if the trends are different. You'll see they're sort of trending upward, although no one we both know that methodology plays a big role in our respective counts. And since there's no one here from Chicago to say how methodology might have differed from this, we don't want to draw any broad conclusions. But you'll see about 6,000 to 7,000 total in their homeless counts. The families has varied a lot from 2,000 to 3,000. So you see what I was saying about it used to be that 2/3 of their homeless were individuals, and now it's more like 60-40. The chronic homelessness has varied a lot. It really went down in 2013. So this makes you wonder, are they doing something right as well? I think that they have been focusing on it quite a bit as well. Again, we can't say too much about how much of this is methodology changes and how much of it is true decreases in homelessness or even weather, like you say. But just as kind of a juxtaposition too. Okay. How long are people homeless? I'm going to start going a little bit faster here, but this point that I made earlier about most people move in and out of homelessness very quickly. Joel is director of PADS organization. We have similar organizations in Suburban Cook County, about 5 of them, that are seasonal shelters. And so it's not somewhere where you go live for years and years. It's you really different places on different nights of the week, and it's just 6 months out of the year. So it's interesting to look at how long do people stay. Our experience in Suburban Cook County is that about half are in the bottom group. Let me explain real quickly. These are 3 seasons worth of data. So 2010, 2011 is the first line. 2012 to 2013 is the season that ended. We're about to end our 2013-2014 season. There appear to be more people in the more recent season, but I will tell you that that's just better data quality. So this 3rd line is probably just a better representation of an annual number of people served by these PADS type shelters. About half, or 48.5% in the most recent year, stay 7 shelter nights or fewer over the course of the whole season. They are there and gone, generally in a week or less. So what's the implication? Let's stay out of their way is the implication to me. Let's not, line them up for an intensive intervention if really at least half are self-resolving, essentially. If you consider the bottom 2 groups together, that would be 0 to 30 shelter nights. Now we're talking about 2/3 of the people, or about 70% of shelter guests are gone within 30 days. You see the average is about 32 shelter nights. So again, there's a planning implication here that we want to stay out of the way of people who will self-resolve, and we really want to focus in on kind of that top slice and to a lesser extent the top 2 slices. Let's really focus in on, if you aren't gone quickly, there's probably something else going on here that we need to focus on. Okay. What are we doing about it? I will cover this very briefly, but our organization, the Alliance to End Homelessness in Suburban Cook County, is the lead agency for a continuum of care. That basically means we run a coalition of all the shelters and housing programs that serve homeless and formerly homeless people, and all the services that go along with that. Each of these components looks a little bit different in the suburbs than in the city. So shelter tends to be that seasonal overnight shelter, pads on the floor of basements, different churches, different nights of the week, and Joel will go into more detail about that. Transitional housing could be a building, or it could be apartments that are rented out in the community from private landlords. In the suburbs, it tends to be that. There are very few buildings that are transitional housing. So a program, some nonprofit agency is helping to cover a portion of your rent, and then they've got a case manager or a services coordinator that you meet with to work on budgeting and some other things to make sure that you're good to go in 24 months or less. That's transitional housing. Permanent supportive housing is aimed at those homeless individuals and families who have a disability that impacts them. There is no clock ticking. You don't have to leave within 24 months. The length of stay isn't necessarily much longer than transitional housing, but the idea is that there's no clock ticking. It's permanent supportive housing. Same thing, it could be a building, or more likely than not in the suburbs, it's some agency helping to make sure that a portion of your rent is paid and the services are there to make sure that you're successful in being stably housed. Prevention is when we try to get you before you become homeless. So people who are behind on the rent, they're about to be evicted. Prevention assistance is when there's a little bit of help to catch you up on your rent so that you don't lose your security deposit and all your furniture and have to stay in a shelter and really start over. Prevention is pretty cost effective as long as it's targeted well. Rapid rehousing is similar, but it's for people who are already in homelessness. It tends to be a few months of help, paying your rent, and then, you know, it's a leg up, but it's not a real intensive intervention. It's a few months of help. Street outreach we'll go into more detail about later, but it is literally that. It's teams of people who go out in the middle of the night and try to find people who are unsheltered, offer them services, get them engaged, and then hopefully connect them to housing in a relatively short period of time. And so those look a little bit different in the suburbs than in the city.
All right, so there's my logo.
Must be your turn to talk.
It must be. I don't like the name PADS, actually. I know I'm the director of it, but I think that one of the problems we've always run into is nobody really knows what PADS is. We've actually gotten checks from donors that said that this is in honor of their poor deceased pet because they think we're Paws, the animal shelter. But that's just an aside.
You sent it back?
We had to send it back. It was a good-sized check, too. So I want to talk about shelter. And I think that everybody kind of has, you know, like we have the definition of what homelessness is. We probably have an idea of what shelter is. And so we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to ask you to tell me what a homeless shelter is. Describe it. Anybody see The Pursuit of Happiness? Will Smith?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, communal living for sure. Right?
Communal living? Yeah. Yeah, you don't really have a bedroom or anything.
Right.
Finite supply.
In many cases, yes. You know, how many beds are there? How many places are there to sleep? What else is a shelter? What does it mean? Is it literally just a roof over the head? Is there more to it?
They vary.
Church basement?
Church basement, very often, yes.
Temporary.
Temporary, there were a couple over here too.
I was just saying they vary. Some could be like a church, other ones could be like an actual organization that has housing where they might have food as well for them in the morning or in the night, or things for them to do too, kind of outreach. So it varies.
Okay. And with
I was going to say, usually fairly regimented in terms of like the hours when you're allowed in, hours when you're allowed out, what you're allowed to do.
absolutely, and that's
Stay there.
you'll
stay there.
there's. I'm going to go to some song lyrics, but there's some about the shelter line going around the corner. People, I need to be here by 3 p.m. If I don't, I'm not going to get a spot, or I need to do this, that, or the other thing. And if I don't follow the rules exactly right, I'm not going to have a place. And that building, I think that limited capacity, that's kind of what people think of when they think of shelters. Again, with The Pursuit of Happiness, if you all haven't seen it, go see it. But there is this scene where Will Smith is playing a character, and he's literally just trying to get in line to make sure that he has a spot to stay in this one building. The building is the shelter. And now what we do at PADS is similar to what we do at a lot of different other suburban communities. You had mentioned church basements, and that is basically what it is. PADS is the organization, and we have kind of like a day center. The day center is where people kind of come in, check in, get their initial assessment, the things that they're going to need in order to overcome the barriers that they're facing to getting out of homelessness, and they do that at our day center. But then what happens is that there are churches throughout all of Lake County. We're in all 4 quadrants of the county, making sure that there's something there, and then we can provide, this is where I think we're a little unique compared to some other places, we provide transportation from our day center, which is located in North Chicago. It's right Middle Eastern part of the county. Wouldn't really make sense, but the Central Eastern, whatever you would want to call it. But we're located there, and then we provide the transportation from there to the shelter sites. Individuals can also go to those sites. Some of them do have cars, some of them have other transportation that they can go to those sites. But we work with these churches to provide the shelter. And then it is literally mats on the floor. There's a mat on the floor, and we just make sure that there's a place for them to be that is safe, that is out of the cold, and that there's, we try and lend as much dignity as possible to it. But there's that communal living aspect of it. And it ain't the Ritz. It's a very difficult place to be, but it is something that is certainly much better than the alternative. So I'm going to touch a little bit on PADS, the PADS Central, as we would call it, where the intake takes place, and then how we work with the shelter component of it. But our main location where people come in, that's where they come when they're experiencing homelessness. Maybe, when something happens, they may get a referral from like our local health department, a police department, others, or they may just know that we're the place to be. We try and have as many access points to getting to us as possible. And so they will come to us, and we will do that initial screening and assessment. And so what we want to do, and we'll touch on this a little bit later too, is we want to make sure that wherever we provide them assistance, or whoever we refer them to, is going to be the right place. We don't want to just say, okay, you can stay in the shelter tonight, and then good luck tomorrow, hopefully you can figure something out. We want to make sure that we're assessing them and figuring out what are their barriers, what are the services that we as a local, we as an organization can provide, and what are the services that our partners in the community can provide. So we do that assessment there. Now, we always want to make sure that, when we're doing that, it's not just the daytime services. We need to make sure that they literally do have a place to sleep. That's the shelter part of it. And so we have a big old blue school bus. It looks straight out of the Partridge Family. But we take that from our main location to the different shelter sites so that those people have a place to sleep. We work with the congregations to be able to volunteer and just provide meals, other things at the site. They take care of everybody there while they're there. Then we pick them up in the morning and work on the assessment and referral part of it too. We are, as I was kind of saying, we're at that entry point to the continuum of care. So many of the things that Jennifer was mentioning, the prevention, the permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, well, you don't just go knock on somebody's door and say, I would like transitional housing, please. There's this process that normally occurs, and we are that entry point. You start with PADS, you start with the emergency shelter, make sure that you are not sleeping outside, make sure that you have a safe, warm place to sleep, and then we work with you to get you into the program that is going to be the right type of assistance. We'll be touching on that part a little bit later on our assessments and everything, but it is kind of the first step that people take to get out of the homeless situation.
It's interesting, we don't have a bus.
I know, we're
In Suburban Cook County.
we are unique when it comes to that. It's on its last legs, though. We're going to be looking at a new one. Yeah.
Interesting. So, transportation is definitely hard for PADS guests in Suburban Cook County and apparently anywhere but Lake County, I guess. There's a PADS organization near Arlington Heights, Journeys the Road Home. One of the things that they do is they involve volunteers in fixing up used bikes, and they provide bikes to these folks who are finding some way. And the northwest suburbs are very spread out. We're going to talk about the transportation, car-focused nature of the suburbs. But so that bike is one of the strategies they've come up with to help people get where they're going. All right, so quickly about the Alliance to End Homelessness in Suburban Cook County, which I'm director of. We lead the Cook County Continuum of Care. We do it in partnership with Cook County, and our friends from Cook County are here. Our role is as an intermediary. We're really a planning organization. We look at data. We're very outcome and data driven. We have lots of committees and groups of people and process to come up with what are the right interventions for the right target populations so that we're using resources really effectively. Part of what we do is we help make decisions about how $11 million in federal assistance grants get used in Suburban Cook County, so that those resources are being used effectively. We operate a homeless management information system, basically a client database. It's a web-based thing where all of our member organizations track information about the people who are participating in homeless-related programs. Since we're pretty broad, you saw the map before, we divide our work into 3 regional councils. There's a North, a West, and a South Council. They each meet monthly. Our Alliance meets monthly. We have a half a dozen committees in addition to that many of which meet monthly. So we're very, you get it, we're a planning organization. Many of you are planning students. We joined the 100,000 Homes campaign in July of 2012. That's the campaign to really focus on those long-term homeless. I've got a whole slide about that, so I won't go into much detail about that now, but that's been very transformational to how we approach what it is that we do as a planning organization. So we'll get to that.
How are you funded?
A lot of our funding comes from HUD. There's some funding that is associated with running that information system. We have some Cook County CDBG Community Development Block Grant funding, some Emergency Solutions Grant funding, the ESG that Laura mentioned, a little bit of that, and that's for the information system piece of it again, and then some philanthropic support. But a decent amount of what we do is to carry out HUD's instructions as to what a continuum of care is supposed to look like. So they've finally come around to figuring out that they need to pay local groups to do that. I think we're kind of unique in that we've got a nonprofit specifically organized to do this. Our purpose in being founded was to lead the continuum of care and to be the lead entity for this homeless management information system. I think in many of the collar counties, the county government plays a bigger role, although many are trying to get nonprofits started to take more of an independent role with this. In Chicago, there's a Chicago Alliance to End Homelessness, which is similar. It's a nonprofit incorporated to do this, and a few other things. They're bigger than us and therefore broader than us. But I think Suburban Cook County is the second biggest continuum in the state, so we have a certain scale. That's everything that the city does is 4 or 5 times bigger, but we're significantly larger than kind of everybody else. So sometimes we look at how to scale down what the city is doing. Sometimes we look at our friends in the collar counties and figure out how to scale up, and sometimes neither of those things work, and we have to figure out what will work for Suburban Cook County. All right, we'll turn for a minute to talk about growing suburban poverty. There's been a decent amount of research that has come out about this recently. I mentioned a few of these things here. If you want to copy them down, do, because I'm going to, on the next slide, talk about the research themes. So I'm only going to spend a moment on this slide. But Elizabeth Kneebone and Alan Berube wrote this recently released book, Confronting Suburban Poverty in America. That was kind of a big deal. It's promoting the insight that half the people in poverty live in the suburbs. It's no longer that 2/3 of people in poverty live in central cities. Now, at least half are living in suburban areas, and so that has implications for the safety net, because suburban areas are just organized very differently from central cities. The Social Impact Research Center, which is based here in Chicago, wrote a smaller piece. It's called Poverty Matters. It's now 50-50. Chicago Region Poverty Growth is a Suburban Story. That was also released last year in 2013. And then Scott Allard and Benjamin Roth from the University of Chicago, a few years ago in 2010, released this study, Strained Suburbs, the Social Service Challenges of Rising Suburban Poverty. That piece really focused on that the nonprofit-led safety net programs are just organized very differently and than they are in the city, and this very rapid increase in poverty in the suburbs has taxed the ability of the safety net organizations in the suburbs to respond, because it's just, the scale is so notable. Okay, so some of the themes of this research I've touched on. That poverty programs, when we think about federal safety net programs, when we think about the philanthropic response, the whole bit, they're really designed around urban poverty. You know, it's not the Department of Housing and Community Development, it's Housing and Urban Development. CUPA has U in the name. So we're really, I'm a city planner by training as well. And so, right, we're used to thinking about these problems in terms of what does it look like in the city. So some of the tools don't fit anymore when you're talking about redeveloping a downtown neighborhood or a central city neighborhood. That looks very different than dealing with suburban poverty. Same thing, government programs and foundations still are very urban focused. As resources constrict, this gets even more pronounced. A lot of foundations have to limit their scope somehow, and a really logical way to do it is to say, oh, well, let's just do the city limits. That's where a lot of the need is, so let's do that. Well, the problem is that most of the foundations have come to that conclusion, Chicago Community Trust being the notable exception. So, you know, there's some really important work that's happening in the suburbs that is just, it's not even within the thought process of a lot of foundations. Nonprofits not being up to the challenge, the safety net too disjointed. That's a theme of the Confronting Suburban Poverty book, as well as the Scott Allard Strained Suburbs piece, where these nonprofit organizations were designed for other things. I'll use an example from our own Suburban Cook County, where there's an organization that used to focus on senior services, and they sort of dabbled in homeless stuff, and all of a sudden they're doing homelessness prevention and transitional housing and a lot of other things. But they really, you know, their board of directors tends to be people who have known that organization for decades and were really kind of focused on senior services. And this other thing is they're just kind of dabbling in that. Well, it's kind of hard to dabble in something as significantly different from senior services as homelessness. All right, and the example that Joel and I both thought of when we wanted to express how the safety net is very disjointed in the suburbs is for us, we have a suburban call line in Suburban Cook County. We keep hoping that 211 will come along and allow us to not organize things in this way. But there's really not, until before 2009, there was not a place you could call and say, I need help in Suburban Cook County, I'm about to lose my housing, or what have you. You had to just call all the numbers that you could find. And if you called CETA, and CETA said, I'm out of money, they would give you a half a dozen other numbers, and you would call all of them, and they would say the same thing, and give you another half a dozen numbers. It was very extremely disjointed. When there was some stimulus money available to improve upon that, we took a city resource, the Homelessness Prevention Call Center, and expanded it to the suburbs. The stimulus money ran out. We kept the 877 number, the toll-free number, but basically there's a Google Voice line that it connects to that forwards it to rotating agencies on different days of the week. Some volunteer or some poor case manager who's got 80 other things to do spends part of their day, and it's just 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., answering calls from people who are looking for some kind of help. And they give them a very brief answer. It was just basically 2-minute call, enough to get them to a person. So we think of it as an interim solution. We keep hoping that 211 will show up and save the day so that we don't have, it's really kind of a voluntary thing, although there's some small amount of resources that are going into it now. It's really challenging, and it's very democratic, and it can be very frustrating at times to approach it in that way. But that's kind of the best that we can do in the short term. DuPage has got a really great information and referral mechanism. It's through DuPage County. You guys have kind of got something set up in Lake County.
We do. We have something, it's called Find Help Lake County. And all you have to do when you're experiencing homelessness is get on the internet and find how to get to the nearest shelter. And that's never a problem. But that's, I think that's, I think that kind of speaks to, you know, some of the issues with 211. Everybody familiar with 211, at least conceptually? It's kind of like 911 except for social services. If you need something, you dial 211. And then there's somebody there that can triage you and help get you the resources that you need. Illinois is Illinois. We're one of the only states in the union that does not have 211 throughout. There is a 211 system down in Bloomington and covers much of the rest of the state, but Chicago and the collar counties, it does not exist. There's a lot of work going that way, but I think that it does speak, if you could go to the next slide, this is a wonderful transition opportunity to some of our unique suburban barriers. And I'm going to skip to the fourth one just because we're talking about it now, is our bajillion. Actual research is done into this. There are, in fact, a bajillion units of local government. It is very difficult to get everybody on the same page in order to address something like homelessness, like poverty, like anything like that. 211, I'll just continue to use that as an example because it's something we can talk about, but there is a, in Lake County we have about 700,000 people. And we have 51 municipalities. We have 18 townships. We have, I don't even know how many other special districts. You need to get all those people on the same page in order to get 211 to occur, and it becomes increasingly difficult. We also have the problems of dealing with different police departments. We have the problems of dealing with different elected officials, different policies, different ordinances, everything that can have an impact of homelessness. It's not just going to Mayor Emanuel and saying, hey, we need to fix this, and of course he's going to go along with it.
I'm sure it's that easy.
Isn't it? I've been watching Chicagoland on CNN. But it's all these different groups, and it's very difficult to coordinate among those bajillion units. I'll go back up to the top, and very similarly, the broad geography. There's in Lake County, again, I'll speak to that. You know, we have farms next to suburban malls, next to, you know, what we consider almost like a small city. You know, it's a very wide area with a lot of different things within it. The lack of street outreach we touched on a little bit. We don't have teams going to hit the streets, partly because we don't necessarily have these hot spots that we can go to. We can't send a team to Lower Wacker Drive because we don't have a Lower Wacker Drive. We wouldn't want to use our resources in an area that is not going to be beneficial. So we don't have that ability to go out to the streets because we don't really know where to go. Transportation, Jennifer touched on this a little bit. We are in the suburbs very car focused. If you don't have a car, you don't get much anywhere. In Lake County, there's we have PACE, and one of my favorite, and not to criticize Pace, I'm not intending to do that, but one of my favorite things. Okay. One of my favorite things about when talking about that when it comes to transportations in the suburbs is Pace had a hearing, basically, public engagement session, I guess they called it, to talk about the ways that they could do a better job. And that hearing started at 7 o'clock, and it was on a bus route, and everything was great. Pace stops running at 6 o'clock. So all of the people, it was wonderful. Several of the people came up and said, well, I'm glad that you're here to hear my input, but I don't know how I'm going to get home after this because your bus stops running. And so I think that really showed it's a good example I've used a lot, in that transportation, for public transportation that is very limited in the suburbs. You need to have that vehicle, and sometimes you have the bike. We have our big blue bus. It's trying to find that transportation through a variety of different sources because there's just not a transportation infrastructure in place. And then Jennifer was going to touch a little bit on the poverty funding. I'll say what in Lake County has 3 jurisdictions that get funding to address poverty. It is Lake County, the city of Waukegan, and the city of North Chicago. And I thought that was complicated until I talked to Jennifer.
I described this problem to people at HUD headquarters, and they're like, we don't know of other places in the country that have it quite this bad. But Suburban Cook County, the geography that, for example, Cook County CDBG funds are supposed to cover is the Swiss cheese that's left when you take out a dozen entitlement communities. So I could go back to that map, but let's not. So there are a number that are in kind of the northwest suburbs, a cluster of them in the west, very few in the south, which is interesting, right? Because the south suburbs are more well-known for having low-income people in poverty than the northwest suburbs, Arlington Heights and Palatine and so forth, for example. But because they developed at an earlier point in history when city boundaries tended to be smaller, they just don't have as many people. But there are a lot of different bajillion local governments there. The Northwest, Cook County, that area, they just have larger places like Schaumburg and so forth that they developed later. They're bigger, they're not necessarily higher poverty than these south suburban municipalities, but they're just bigger. So they fit that 50,000 threshold. So each of these dozen entitlement communities, they write their own consolidated plan, if you know what that is. They administer their own CDBG funding, which for many of them might be less than $90,000. I mean, it's yet they give it out in 12 pieces and they have quarterly reporting and the whole bit. So a lot of administrative burden that goes with that, not just for them, but for the nonprofit agencies that are carrying out those programs. We just figured out that there are a lot of different federal programs that follow kind of the same formula. So those dozen entitlement communities all get their own CDBG, but only a couple of them get their own emergency solutions grant, ESG funding. So we've been wondering recently, well, where does their below threshold portion go if you're over 50,000 people, but not big enough to get your own ESG? It would make sense, right, that it goes to Cook County. Well,
but it doesn't.
But it doesn't. It goes to the balance of state allocation. We just this week did the math on it, and in FY 2014, the emergency solutions grant funding that Cook County will get is around $900,000. It should be $500,000 more than that if truly the ESG formula were based on the need data for people who are in suburban Cook County. Instead, if you're one of those holes in the Swiss cheese that's big enough to have CDBG but too small to have ESG, your ESG funding went to the balance of state. The state has made the decision that Cook County, isn't Chicago up there? They have plenty of money, and in fact, Chicago has plenty of money. But, so they don't even, they refuse to use their ESG funding in suburban Cook County, or in Cook County anywhere, because they figure, well, we just get some of Chicago's money, right? But we don't. So that's pretty notable, 900,000 versus we should be getting $500,000 more than that, and we're gonna try and figure out how to get it. But it'll probably be hard, and it'll probably be just as many quarterly reports to 4 different sources, because it's in these illogical different little pockets. So that's, yeah, that's kind of the craziness.
It is certainly is illogical, but as one of the organizations that benefits from the balance of state funding, I'm all for it. All right, so we've talked about enough bad things. Now we're going to start talking about some solutions. This is all where the progress that has been made in the suburbs and some of the things that we're planning on doing. This is where we're very excited about some of the things that are occurring. First of all, especially when it comes to homelessness, there's a lot of national momentum in doing something about it. We view this as an issue, not just us, the people who are advocating for it, but the United States Congress and the United States government, many people of influence there, are viewing homelessness as something that we can not only manage, but ultimately end. Homelessness is not something that needs to occur in the United States of America. So there have been a number of different strategies and a number of different techniques, including the funding to back it up, to try and make an effort to end homelessness. We started out by working to end the chronic homelessness. As Jennifer had mentioned, that is a small percentage of the population. They use a lot of the resources. It winds up being cheaper for us to be able to put them into some sort of unit, subsidize their rent, and keep them in that, provide them the supports they need there. Cheaper than having them in the shelter, going to the emergency room, going to jail every once in a while, taking advantage of all of these other community services. You put them in housing, subsidize the rent there. It is significantly cheaper to do it that way. After addressing chronic homelessness, the next phase came up with veterans homelessness. And there's this push now to really end veterans homelessness. Veterans are disproportionately represented in the homeless population. There are many more veterans experiencing homelessness than there would expect to be if it was just reflective of the overall population. And so there's a very similar push. There's basically there's a program called HUD-VASH. We use bad acronyms, I'm sorry, but the VASH program is for VA supportive housing, and it's basically a Section 8 voucher for veterans, and it puts them into a housing unit where they can again get the services that they need coming to them or linked up within the community. And so we've worked on that. We started working on ending family homelessness as well, looking at the rapid rehousing, which is a relatively new concept, trying to get people that if they do experience homelessness, it's only for a little bit. We get them into shelter, we get them right out. We don't need to be in a place where people are lingering in the street, lingering in shelter, lingering in places that they don't need to be. We had talked about the coordinated assessment process, that what PADS does is when people come in, we're going to be talking to you, we're going to be interviewing you, trying to figure out what the barriers you are facing. And it's not an assembly line. It's not you come here and then we're just going to send you to the next step because that's what happens. We want to make sure that we are providing the right type of assistance, the right amount of that assistance, and the right time for that assistance. And so it's a very comprehensive assessment, making sure that we are identifying all of those different things. And then, instead of just sending them one step, we might send them any number of different directions to be able to get them into the proper place and get them out of that homeless situation. That talks a little bit about these shelters as a filtering mechanism. When you look at some of the older research on it is very urban focused, that we had these big buildings that were shelters and people just needed to go to those and you needed to get rid of those. That was the answer. If you got rid of those, people would be able to get some of the other supports that they need. You don't need that big old shelter that's causing in many ways some of the homelessness to persist. And we don't have that in the suburbs. We don't have that shelter that is causing homelessness to persist, that provides providing an opportunity basically for people to linger and get caught up in the system and ultimately become chronically homeless because they just stay in that shelter. That becomes home. And so we don't have that problem in the suburbs. So we don't have to take it apart, which is nice. You know, when you can just add other solutions and use the shelter as a filter, that screening tool, that's a great way to utilize shelter. Then we also have the 100,000 Homes campaign. Jennifer touched on it a little bit earlier, and she's going to touch on it a little bit more now.
But before we leave this slide, I just wanted to add that kind of within the homeless advocacy community, there's been this rift in the last 10 years, I would say, between the housing first groups and the groups that really think we should continue to focus on shelter. And I would say just recently, there's been more effort to bridge that divide, recognizing that shelter is not the problem. Shelter can serve an important filtering mechanism where, remember what I was saying about those folks that stay 7 shelter nights or fewer. Let's stay out of their way. Some places within the first week they're going to want to sit down and do an assessment with you. I think that's not true of Suburban Cook County shelters where, you know, if you've been around for a week or more, then let's start figuring out why that is and what to do about it. So if there was ever any doubt of the role that shelters can play, there is definitely a productive role for shelters, but it can't be an end in and of itself. We don't have these problematic buildings, this infrastructure that needs to be dismantled in order to do something different. For better or for worse, we're kind of starting with a cleaner slate and we can adopt these newer practices without having to make the case that this, you know, large building needs to be repurposed for something else, for instance. So 100,000 Homes, I mentioned it before, that it's a national campaign to find and to house the most vulnerable, long-term homeless people. There was some research done that really pointed to specific medical conditions that make a person more likely to literally die on the streets if they are an unsheltered homeless person. So this campaign said, we think there are about 100,000 people in the country. Let's find and house them, and in so doing, either end chronic homelessness or get pretty darn close. So the 100,000 Homes campaign got started about 4 years ago. At a national level, they are up to 90,000. So I'm starting to get worried about, okay, what happens when they get to 100,000? Are they still going to return my calls? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that. But we're a relatively new community. They are new to us anyway. We joined about 1.5 years ago. And it's really been transformational for us. The idea is that you create a by name registry of the most vulnerable homeless people. So instead of, let's say for example, one of our strategies is to incentivize less restrictive eligibility criteria in our permanent supportive housing. So what do? We put a couple points associated with that in our project review process for that $11 million. Great, we've been doing that for years and years and years. This kind of, it's toward the same goal, but it's much more direct. When we did this registry, we came up with a list of 111 people out of the 345 surveys that we've done, 111 people that were particularly vulnerable. We created a 150 homes team, a housing placement team that meets monthly. They literally go through the list and say, okay, who's engaging with John Doe? You know, is there a street outreach? Are they able to find this person? Is there housing that would fit that person's needs? By focusing on the people, interestingly, some of the systems goals that we had been working on for some time came into clear view. So we knew, for example, that we wanted a better way to figure out what vacancies we had with permanent supportive housing. Well, now you've got 20 people sitting around the table saying, how do I get Nancy into housing? All of a sudden, there are 20 people who are much more motivated to figure out this problem and figure it out now. How do I figure out where the permanent supportive housing vacancies are? How do they get communicated? So some of the system things follow the people focus instead of just focusing on the system and then the numbers and the people follow. It's kind of the other way around. Street outreach has been absolutely critical. We had almost nothing for street outreach 3 years ago. The Chicago Community Trust invested in street outreach, and now all of a sudden we have enough street outreach that we can pull something like this off. So there are street outreach teams. They don't cover all of Suburban Cook County, but they cover, kind of 4 loci, is that the right word? 4 areas that, it's better than what we had. And so there is some hope of finding a person who's vulnerable and long-term once that housing resource is available to them. We track our monthly placements. The campaign suggested to us an original goal of 6 housing placements per month of people who are vulnerable and or chronically homeless. We figured out that we had been doing 17 to 18 per month. We were in this intensive institute where we crunched some numbers and figured out that based on inflows and outflows, we could, in fact, end chronic homelessness by the end of 2015 if we kept up a rate of 18 per month. Our actual is, in fact, 18 per month in the 20 months that we've been a part of this initiative. Hines VA Hospital and the Housing Authority of Cook County have been critical partners in this. Joel mentioned the VASH vouchers. We have about 350 VASH vouchers, which is pretty significant. I think it's as many of the city, so we're lucky. We have a lot of these VASH vouchers for homeless veterans. The Housing Authority has created a homeless preference in their public housing waiting list and their regular housing choice voucher waiting list. It doesn't put you at the top of the list, but it gives you a couple more points in their process, which is good. It's hard to stay on a list. That list has not opened in, I believe, 13 or 14 years. And so to find somebody who's in and out of homelessness when they added their name to a list 13 years ago is really, you kind of got the cards stacked against you to begin with. So it's good that there's a couple extra points if they can find you. Then finally, flow vouchers. This is something that we adopted from Philadelphia, and the Housing Authority has agreed to it. Now they're waiting on HUD approval, and we're creating processes. But basically what it will be is a set aside of housing choice vouchers for people who are moving on from permanent supportive housing. So you were homeless at one point in time, impacted by a disability, you ended up in permanent supportive housing, you've been there for maybe 6 or 7 years. A lot of those challenges that brought you into homelessness, you've managed to recover and overcome some of those things. Now maybe you're staying in permanent supportive housing because you need the affordable housing piece of it. You may not need those intensive wraparound services that are available to you anymore. The idea of a flow voucher is that person who has been in permanent supportive housing for a long time, who's really stabilized, who really just needs the housing subsidy at this point. They'll get a housing choice voucher to flow out of the permanent supportive housing. Now their housing is supported with a housing choice voucher. In the meantime, you've freed up a spot for somebody who is homeless and vulnerable right now, who needs that permanent supportive housing. So you create this flow out of permanent supportive housing so new people can come in. These are my shameless plugs. We are hiring. We are hiring a full-time permanent program coordinator, and that is listed on idealist.org. We are also looking for a VISTA community liaison. So if anyone is thinking about a year of service at not enough pay, God bless you, you can look that up on the My AmeriCorps website. So we're recruiting for both of those at the same time. That's a 1-year assignment. And that's all that we have to say.
So that's how you get a hold of us.
All right.